The ballroom shimmered with a kind of brilliance that made everything look more beautiful than it really was. Hundreds of candles flickered along the mirrored walls, sending pinpricks of light cascading over crystal centerpieces and silver-plated cutlery. A string quartet was playing something sophisticated and wistful, the notes drifting up toward the vaulted ceiling as if trying to escape the lies floating beneath them. Elaine Harper stood just inside the grand entrance, one hand resting lightly on the carved mahogany doorframe. To anyone watching, she must have looked perfectly composed, regal even, her hair swept into an elegant chignon, her satin gown the precise shade of midnight blue that brought out the cool gray of her eyes. For 40 years, she'd mastered the art of appearing serene, of hiding the way her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird every time her husband's voice took on that amused, dismissive edge. Tonight, she was done pretending. Her gaze swept across the crowd, noting every familiar face. Clients Gregory had courted over decades, fellow philanthropists, aging college friends who liked to tell the same stories about how ambitious he'd been, how unstoppable. A handful of relatives were here too, her sister Marlene, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, and her nephew Simon, already half drunk and grinning at nothing. They were all here to toast 40 years of love, commitment, in the fiction that Elaine had been enough for Gregory Harper. A liveried attendant approached with a thin gold tray. "Mrs. Harper, champagne?" She accepted a glass, more out of habit than desire, and murmured her thanks. The flute trembled almost imperceptibly as she lifted it to her lips. From across the room, she could feel Gregory's eyes on her. He was talking to a tight circle of men near the dais, his head thrown back in an easy laugh. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly, of course it did, and his hair, still mostly black, gleamed under the chandeliers. He looked every inch the man she'd agreed to marry when she was 20 and dazzled by his hunger to build something out of nothing. Elaine had believed in that hunger. She'd fed it in ways that cost her pieces of herself she could never get back. Her art studio, the afternoons she'd spent sketching portraits, had become first a hobby, then a joke, and finally an inconvenience. In its place, she had become the kind of woman who planned fundraisers and learned which fork to use at 10-course dinners. The kind of woman who smiled graciously while her husband's business partner hung on his arm, laughing too loudly, too familiarly. Claudia Reese, 45, polished in the way only money or desperation could make a person shine. Elaine had watched her over the years, watched the way she slipped effortlessly into conversations that were supposed to be private, the way Gregory's expression changed when Claudia touched his wrist in that casual, practiced manner. Elaine had told herself over and over that she was imagining things, that after decades together, of course, Gregory would crave novelty, admiration, fresh eyes that didn't see every flaw, but the doubts had become a slow poison, seeping into her sleep, her bones, her sense of herself. And this morning, when she had been in the conservatory watering the orchids, she'd found it. A thick ivory envelope slid beneath the door. No note, no explanation, just the envelope, bulging slightly. Her hands had shaken as she unsealed it. There were photographs inside, printed on glossy paper that smelled faintly of chemicals. Claudia and Gregory, standing in a resort bar in the Caymans. Claudia and Gregory, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand tangled in his lapel. Another photo, Claudia slipping a key card into the door of a suite, while Gregory stood behind her, looking bored and entitled. The date stamp was 3 weeks ago. Elaine could have burned the envelope. She could have waited until the gala ended, confronted him behind closed doors, kept the spectacle contained. But she was so tired of containing everything, tired of making herself small enough to fit inside the narrative he'd constructed, that she was lucky to have him, that any doubts she had were symptoms of her own inadequacy. Her fingers brushed the edge of her purse, feeling the thickness of the envelope inside. It was there now, a live coal she was ready to drop onto the pristine tablecloth of their perfect evening. Somewhere beyond the hush of the music, she heard the master of ceremonies testing the microphone. A hush rippled across the ballroom as the lights shifted, signaling the first toast was moments away. Elaine drew in a slow, deliberate breath. She had always believed there was a certain power in silence, in knowing something no one else did. But tonight, her silence would end. She lifted her chin, feeling the brittle mask of composure crack, and did not care if anyone saw it. Tonight, she would make them all see everything. The gala unfolded like a well-rehearsed play, each guest playing their assigned part. The servers glided between tables with trays of caviar and blinnies. The violinist transitioned to a sweeping melody that coaxed polite sighs from the older couples near the dance floor. Gregory had always insisted on spectacle. He believed people needed to feel impressed to remain loyal. Elaine watched him from the periphery as he held court near the dais. His gestures were confident, his laughter punctuated by the subtle nods of the men around him. Board members, investors, city officials whose goodwill had been bought in installments over decades. They all knew Gregory Harper as the visionary, the empire builder, the man who could turn a crumbling neighborhood into an oasis of glass and steel. None of them knew what he was when the spotlight moved on. She sipped her champagne without tasting it, her eyes drawn inevitably to Claudia Reese. Claudia was late, though Elaine suspected it was deliberate, an entrance designed to remind everyone she was worth waiting for. When she finally appeared, she wore a fitted red gown that shimmered like spilled wine every time she turned her body. Even from across the ballroom, Elaine saw the flash of the diamond pendant resting low on Claudia's collarbone. Gregory's taste. Gregory's money. Claudia paused in the doorway, scanning the crowd until her gaze settled on Gregory. Her smile appeared, slow and proprietary. It was the same smile Elaine had seen in the photographs, the same tilt of the head. A laugh, low and intimate, carried across the hush. Elaine could almost taste the bitterness rising in her throat, but she forced herself to swallow it down. Tonight wasn't about rage, it was about truth. Elaine set her glass aside and moved closer to the main table. She could feel the curious glances as she passed, people politely pretending not to notice that the guest of honor looked strained, her lips pressed into a line that was dangerously close to trembling. "Elaine, you look breathtaking," crooned Sylvia Harcourt, the wife of one of Gregory's earliest investors. Her voice was sweet as syrup, her eyes assessing. 40 years, imagine. You must be so proud." Proud. Elaine almost laughed, but she only inclined her head, murmuring something gracious before stepping around Sylvia. If she stayed still too long, she was sure she would lose her nerve. A young server appeared beside her, offering a fresh glass of champagne. She declined it with a shake of her head and continued her quiet orbit of the dais, watching as Claudia leaned in to say something to Gregory. His hand drifted to Claudia's lower back, not quite possessive, not quite hidden, just enough to be unmistakable to anyone who cared to look closely. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" The conversations ebbed into silence. Elaine felt her heartbeat thrumming beneath her ribs, felt the old panic threatening to buckle her knees, but she stayed rooted to the spot. "Tonight," the MC continued, beaming, "we gather to honor a love story that has inspired all of us. 40 years of partnership, of family, of success. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Gregory and Elaine Harper." A polite roar of applause filled the ballroom. Gregory gestured magnanimously for Elaine to join him, his smile wide, practiced. As she stepped onto the low stage, she could see the lines around his eyes deepen. He looked for the first time wary. She did not take his hand. Instead, she turned to face the audience, her spine straight. The hush returned, more curious this time. A few people exchanged looks. It was not the picture they expected, the husband and wife glowing with mutual admiration. Gregory cleared his throat. "Elaine, darling." She held up a hand to silence him. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't be long." There was a rustle of confusion. Gregory's smile flickered, and he reached for her elbow. She moved it just out of reach. For a beat, their eyes locked, his dark and imploring, hers glassy but unblinking. Elaine looked out over the sea of familiar faces, all those people who had nodded sympathetically when she spoke of her charity work, who had called her lucky to have married such a brilliant man. She knew some of them had seen hints of the truth and had chosen not to tell her. Let them hear it now. "I'd like to share a story," she said, her fingers brushing the clasp of her evening bag. "It's a story about gratitude and about finally seeing clearly. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Claudia shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing. Gregory's hand fell to his side. Elaine opened her bag and drew out the ivory envelope. It felt heavy as she held it aloft, the contents threatening to scorch her fingers. She looked at Claudia and then at Gregory, whose expression was fast becoming something closer to panic. "Tonight is about honesty," Elaine continued, her voice clear, almost serene. "Because what's the point of celebrating 40 years of marriage if we can't be honest about who we really are?" Gasps. A few camera phones lifted, uncertain whether they were about to witness a toast or a reckoning. Gregory took a step toward her, whispering urgently, "Elaine, don't do this." She turned to face him fully, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. "Don't you dare pretend you can stop me." And then she raised the envelope higher, her arm steady as a blade. For a suspended moment, the ballroom seemed to stop breathing. The hum of the air conditioning, the clink of glassware, everything went silent under the weight of Elaine's outstretched hand and the envelope it held. She could feel the collective curiosity sharpening into a single point, aimed right at her. Years of practice had taught her to endure scrutiny, to smile politely while being assessed like an antique vase, beautiful and irrelevant. But this was different. For the first time in decades, she was not an ornament in Gregory's life. She was the one defining the moment. Gregory's eyes darted from her face to the envelope. His mouth opened, but nothing emerged except a ragged exhale. Elaine didn't lower her arm. "I thought," she began, her voice steady, "that since we're all here to celebrate 40 years of partnership, it would be appropriate to share some memories." An uncertain laugh fluttered near the back of the room, quickly swallowed by the hush. Elaine slipped the first photograph free. The glossy surface caught the chandelier's light as she held it up, turning so the front row could see. Claudia's face in the picture was unmistakable, her features arranged in a smile that was all possession and no shame. Gregory was beside her, his hand around her waist, their bodies pressed together as if they had always belonged to each other. The gasp this time was audible. Several people craned their necks to see better. "This is my husband," Elaine said calmly, "and Claudia Reese, his business partner, as you all know. This was taken at the Sapphire Reef Resort in the Cayman Islands." Gregory surged forward, trying to snatch the photo from her hand, but Elaine stepped sideways, her reflexes honed by weeks of rehearsing this moment in her mind. "I have more," she continued, withdrawing another photo. This one was of them kissing on a balcony, their champagne flutes abandoned on a table nearby. The date in the corner was only 3 weeks old. A murmur traveled through the crowd like an electrical current. Someone gasped Claudia's name, another called Gregory's in a tone between shock and disgust. Claudia shifted in her seat, her complexion draining to a waxy gray. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Elaine moved to the microphone. "I have copies of these," she announced. "I thought it only fair to share them with the people who've invested in Gregory's reputation as a man of integrity." Gregory's voice cracked as he stepped beside her. "Elaine, please, think about what you're doing." She turned the microphone slightly away from her lips and looked him square in the eye. "I've thought about nothing else for months." When she faced the crowd again, her voice rose, sure and clean. "For those of you wondering, yes, I hired a private investigator, because when the lies start to seep into every part of your life, you deserve proof, you deserve clarity, you deserve, at the very least, your dignity back." A smattering of applause broke out, tentative at first, then growing as more guests joined in, recognizing the raw courage it took to expose a betrayal so publicly. Claudia rose unsteadily to her feet. "Elaine, please, we can talk about this privately." "Privately?" Elaine echoed, her eyebrows arching. "You had no interest in privacy when you were booking suite after suite with my husband." More gasps. A reporter from the local business journal, someone Gregory had bragged about courting for a favorable profile, raised his phone and began recording. Gregory's hand closed around her wrist, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "You're humiliating yourself," he hissed, his face a sickly shade of white. Elaine looked at him without blinking. I'm humiliating you. I can live with that." She turned to the crowd again. If any of you are interested in more details, she said, her voice carrying over the stunned silence, I'd be happy to share the expense reports. I'm sure the investors will be fascinated to learn which company accounts funded these romantic retreats. A commotion erupted, voices rising, chairs scraping, the illusion of decorum finally dissolving under the weight of reality. Claudia was backing away, her hands trembling as she tried to smooth her gown. Gregory released Elaine's wrist as though it had burned him. Elaine slipped the photos back into the envelope and held it against her chest, feeling a strange, quiet finality settle over her. For so long she had feared this moment, feared the humiliation, the judgment, the sense of having failed. But standing there, she realized she felt none of those things. What she felt instead was free. She stepped closer to the microphone one last time. Thank you for coming tonight, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. She left the stage without looking back, the applause and gasps and murmurs swirling behind her like a storm she no longer needed to outrun. Elaine descended the steps from the dais as if the floor might vanish under her feet. She felt the collective gaze of 100 witnesses drilling into her back, but she refused to turn around. Let them stare. Let them see her. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to hide. Behind her, Gregory's voice struggled for authority. Ladies and gentlemen, please, this is a misunderstanding. But the crowd was no longer listening to him. A ripple of voices rose in waves, overlapping like a tide of disbelief. Guests who had once clamored for Gregory's attention were now averting their eyes, whispering behind their palms. Even those who clung to polite neutrality couldn't pretend not to have seen the photos, the receipts, the evidence that left no room for doubt. Elaine felt a hand brush her shoulder. She turned and found Marlene, her sister, her face tight with something that looked like sorrow, or maybe admiration. Do you want me to get your coat? Marlene asked softly. No, Elaine murmured. I'm not finished. She walked to the table where the event photographer was packing his equipment, his expression wary. Elaine placed a trembling hand on the folder tucked under her arm. I'd like you to make copies, she said quietly, for everyone here. If they're going to talk about me tomorrow, I'd rather they get the story straight. The photographer hesitated. Ma'am, I don't know if... She met his eyes. You were hired to document this night, weren't you? After a beat, he nodded. Then document it, she said, pressing a folded bill into his palm. All of it. He swallowed hard, then began feeding the photos into his portable scanner. As the machine hummed, Gregory moved through the crowd, trying to intercept the ripple of outrage before it became a tidal wave. You don't understand, he was insisting to a group of stone-faced investors. Elaine's overreacting. It was just a friendship that went too far. But the evidence was already in the guests' hands. A woman from the local museum foundation stared down at the photo of Claudia and Gregory on the balcony, her lips parted in horror. I trusted you, she whispered when Gregory tried to place a placating hand on her arm. I vouched for you. Please, he said, voice ragged. This doesn't have to affect the company. Doesn't it? The woman snapped. You used company money to carry on your affair. That's fraud, Gregory. The word hung in the air, loud enough to turn every head nearby. Claudia, meanwhile, was frozen by the buffet, her eyes glassy. Her earlier poise had vanished, replaced by a brittle, hunted look. When she caught Elaine watching her, her mouth worked silently before she finally stammered. Elaine, I swear, I never meant... Elaine cut her off with a single lifted hand. Don't pretend to apologize. You meant every moment. Claudia flinched as though struck. In the far corner, the event photographer began passing out fresh copies of the evidence, each page stamped discreetly in the corner with the date and time. The guests clutched them like damning relics. Gregory surged forward, grabbing Elaine's wrist again, this time harder. This is enough, he hissed, his face blotched crimson. Do you understand what you're doing? You're ruining everything. Elaine didn't pull away. She simply looked at his hand and then back at his face, her voice level as she replied, No, Gregory. You ruined everything. I'm just making sure no one forgets who did it. His mouth opened and closed. For once, no slick rebuttal arrived. A hush settled around them as more guests crowded closer, the tension crackling through the room like a downed wire. Elaine felt something inside her settle, a decision made long ago, one she had never dared to name. "I've already filed the paperwork," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the gathered onlookers. "For divorce and for an audit of your business accounts. Let's see how much you've stolen from your investors to pay for your friendships." Gregory went pale, his hand slipping from her wrist. You wouldn't." Her gaze didn't waver. "I would. I have." In that instant, Claudia turned and bolted, nearly knocking over a waiter. Her red gown vanished through the ballroom doors, a bright slash of disgrace Elaine would remember for the rest of her life. Gregory made a small, helpless sound in the back of his throat. It struck Elaine that she had never heard him sound so small. "Elaine," he whispered, "please." She studied him, searching for any trace of the man she had married. All she saw was fear, and she realized she felt nothing for him anymore. Not love, not longing, not even hate. Only the clean, cold relief of finally telling the truth. She lifted her chin and addressed the crowd. "I think that's all you need to know. If you'd like to see the financial records, my attorney will have copies by Monday morning." A beat of stunned silence, and then, impossibly, applause. It began with Marlene and spread outward, gathering force until it filled the cavernous ballroom. Elaine let it wash over her without moving, without smiling. She had never wanted their pity, but she would take their respect. The applause faded as quickly as it had begun, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable hush. No one seemed to know what to do next. Guests clutched their champagne flutes, their eyes flicking between Gregory and Elaine, like spectators at a wreck they couldn't look away from. Gregory pressed both palms flat on the nearest table, his shoulders rising and falling with ragged breaths. He looked older in that moment than Elaine had ever seen him, his face sagging, the sharp lines of triumph that had once defined him now softened by humiliation. "I can fix this," he whispered to no one in particular. "I can—" But even he didn't sound convinced. Elaine felt a sudden, surreal sense of pity, the way she might have felt for an injured animal. But it dissolved the instant she remembered the photographs, the receipts, the years she had wasted believing she was the problem when the rot had been inside him all along. A commotion stirred near the dais. The reporter from the Business Journal was speaking rapidly into her phone, her eyes glittering with the thrill of breaking scandal. Gregory's attorney, a spare man in a midnight suit, approached with hesitant steps. "Gregory," he murmured, "I suggest we leave before this escalates further." "It's already escalated," Elaine replied evenly, not bothering to look at either man. "And it will escalate more. I have all the bank statements showing how much he spent on Claudia and how much came from accounts labeled as consulting expenses." The attorney's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. "You understand, Mrs. Harper, that this will trigger a forensic audit." "I'm counting on it," she said. Across the room, Claudia's absence was a gaping wound no one dared mention. The seat she'd abandoned sat conspicuously empty, a reminder that some exits could never be undone. Gregory swayed as though the realization had finally struck. The empire he'd built so ruthlessly was no longer under his control. Elaine had held the match to it all along, and she had set it ablaze. A voice piped up from the crowd. "Gregory, did you really use investor money to pay for your mistress?" He looked up, his mouth working as though trying to form words he no longer believed. "No, I'll explain everything." Elaine turned to face the guests. "He'll explain nothing you can trust." Another voice, this one flat with disappointment, cut across the stunned silence. "I should have believed you, Elaine." She turned to see Sylvia Harcourt, her eyes glistening. "He made you feel small for so many years," Sylvia said quietly. "I'm sorry." Elaine inclined her head, acknowledging the truth of it without needing to say anything more. The photographer returned with the last stack of printed evidence. He set it gently on a nearby table as though it might explode. No one moved to stop him. Gregory's hands were shaking now, visible tremors betraying the final collapse of his composure. He opened his mouth, but before any words emerged, Elaine spoke first. "You don't get to ask me for anything ever again," she said softly. "Not my silence, not my forgiveness, not my help." He flinched, the words landing heavier than any slap. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping the faces that had once looked at her with polite condescension. "This is what happens when you believe you're too powerful to be held accountable," she said. "You forget that the person you underestimate might one day stop protecting you." It was a statement of fact, not triumph. But the hush that followed was the sound of an empire breaking apart. Elaine exhaled slowly, feeling a clarity she hadn't known in years. The panic that had shadowed her every day, the fear of confrontation, the dread of exposure, was gone. In its place was something clean and final. She stepped back to the microphone. A few guests lifted their phones again, their faces taut with anticipation. Gregory made a hoarse sound of protest, but the attorney placed a steadying hand on his arm, as if he knew any further interruption would only deepen the damage. Elaine's voice was calm. "Before I leave you all to the rest of your evening, I have one final thing to say." A hush descended. Even the servers froze, clutching trays of canapes that no one wanted anymore. "I spent 40 years helping build Gregory's career," she said. "I planned his fundraisers, managed the household, raised our daughter mostly alone. And when he found someone younger and more pliable, he decided I was no longer useful." A tremor ran through her as she inhaled, but she refused to look away from the crowd. "That ends tonight," she continued, her voice rising. "I have already signed over a significant portion of my marital assets, more than $3 million, to the Safe Haven Women's Shelter. It's an organization dedicated to helping women rebuild their lives after betrayal and abuse." A shocked gasp swept the ballroom. Someone began to clap, hesitant, uncertain. Another joined, and another. Elaine didn't flinch when the applause gathered strength. She waited until it subsided before finishing. "This," she said, gesturing around the ballroom, "was supposed to be a celebration of my loyalty. But loyalty without respect is just servitude. So tonight I'm reclaiming my freedom, and I'm honoring the women who taught me that leaving isn't weakness, it's survival." The applause came again, this time thunderous. Elaine felt her eyes sting, but held her composure as she set the microphone gently back into its stand. Gregory's mouth moved soundlessly. Claudia was still nowhere to be seen. Elaine turned her back to them both. At the last moment, she paused and looked over her shoulder. "This will be the last time you see us together," she said simply. "Enjoy the memory." Then she stepped off the stage and walked toward the exit, her steps measured and unhurried. She felt no impulse to look back. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter than Elaine expected. Only the muted strains of the quartet and the low buzz of stunned conversations leaked through the heavy double doors. She stopped beneath a gilt-framed mirror, studying her reflection with an almost clinical detachment. Her face looked different to her, stripped of the polite mask she'd worn so long, luminous in its rawness. For a moment, she didn't see a woman scorned. She saw someone who had survived. Her hand drifted to the necklace at her throat, a gift from Gregory on their 20th anniversary. She unfastened it carefully and set it on the side table. It felt like shedding a final piece of armor she no longer needed. She had nearly reached the coat check when the doors behind her burst open. Gregory's footsteps pounded across the marble floor. "Elaine! Elaine! Wait!" She didn't turn around, but she didn't keep walking either. Some part of her wanted to hear what excuses he thought would matter now. He stopped a few paces behind her, breathing hard. "Please, just listen to me." Her voice was steady. "I've been listening to you for 40 years. Then listen one more time." His tone was ragged, desperate. "Yes, I made mistakes, but you can't burn it all down. Think about what this will do to our family, to our reputation." She turned then, slowly. "Our reputation? You were thinking about that when you were paying for hotel rooms with company credit cards?" "It wasn't serious," he pleaded. "Claudia, she was a distraction. You and we built a life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Elaine searched his face for any hint of shame or love, anything real beneath the practiced panic. All she saw was a man terrified of losing control. "You didn't think about what any of it meant to me," she said. "You just assumed I would keep pretending because it was easier for everyone else." He stepped closer. "I love you." "No," she replied quietly. "You love owning me. That's not the same thing. His hand lifted as if to touch her face, but she stepped back. The movement seemed to drain the last of his conviction. You can't just walk away, he whispered hoarsely. You don't know what it's like out there, alone. Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so sad. Don't I? I've been alone for years, Gregory. You just never noticed. He sagged against the wall, covering his face with both hands. For an instant, she almost reached for him. Almost. Instead, she turned her back and retrieved her coat. The attendant handed it over without meeting her eyes, as if afraid the truth might be contagious. Gregory's voice followed her as she crossed the marble foyer. Elaine, please. I'm begging you. She paused at the threshold, one hand on the brass door handle. I used to think I'd die without you, she said without turning around. Now I know the only thing that was dying was me. The doors swung open and she stepped into the night. Outside, the city was alive in a way the ballroom never could be. Horns honked in the distance. A cold wind rushed up from the river, swirling her hair around her face, reminding her she was real, awake. She inhaled deeply, savoring the bite of winter air in her lungs. For so many years, she'd stood in the shadow of Gregory's ambitions, convinced her worth was measured by his successes in her silence. Tonight, she'd proven to herself that she was more than the polite woman who stood beside him in photographs. She was someone who could end the lie. Elaine pulled her phone from her clutch and called Marlene. Her sister picked up on the first ring. Is it over? Marlene asked softly. Yes, Elaine said, her voice steady. I'm going to your place. I'll put the kettle on. A taxi slowed beside her, headlights cutting through the darkness. She climbed inside and gave Marlene's address. As the car pulled away, she let her gaze drift back toward the Gala. Through the tall windows, she could see silhouettes moving frantically. Gregory gesturing wildly at the guests who were already drifting toward the exits, eager to disassociate themselves from the scandal. Her freedom. The cab turned the corner, and the building slipped from view. Elaine leaned back against the seat, her heartbeat finally slowing. She opened her evening bag and pulled out a slim leather notebook she'd hidden beneath the envelope of photographs. It was the same journal she'd kept secret in her studio, filled with sketches and notes about the life she'd once wanted, the life she'd convinced herself she wasn't allowed to have. She flipped to a blank page and uncapped her pen. Tonight, I left the version of me who believed silence was safer. The words came easily, as though they'd been waiting for permission to exist. Tonight, I learned that telling the truth can be the most powerful thing a woman ever does. When she finished, she closed the journal and set it in her lap. Her hands were steady, her breath calm. In the next days and weeks, there would be fallout, press releases, lawyers, headlines. But none of it scared her. None of it mattered as much as this single, private certainty. She was done living a life measured by someone else's comfort. She had burned the false story to the ground, and whatever came next, it would be hers alone. As the cab rolled across the bridge, she looked out over the river, feeling the last pieces of her old life drift away in the darkness. Elaine didn't look back. She didn't need to.